Infusions are one of the most interesting aspects of Genshin's combat design, as they allow a character to deal elemental damage without directly using their skill or burst. They can also interact with one another, creating a wide variety of interesting effects. In this video, I'll be going over all these interactions and detailing all their effects. Out of all the elements in the game, only 6 have infusions, with Dendro being the odd element out. Now, before you start typing a comment saying, actually, Kaveh and Alhaven have an infusion, what they and several other characters in the game have are known as elemental conversion. Their entire normal attack string effectively gets replaced by a different one that deals elemental damage and can't be overridden. The can't be overridden aspect of elemental conversions is what makes them different from infusions, as infusions can actually be overridden. This will be further discussed in the infusion interaction section of this video. Stepping back to elements for a second, out of the 6 with infusions, only 3 have characters that can give others their elemental infusion from the patch I am recording this video on, which is patch 5.3. Candace for Hydro, Chongyun for Cryo, and Bennett at C6 for Pyro. For the purposes of organizing this video, I'll call their infusions external infusions, and the characters that can provide them as external infusers, as they can be given to any character wielding a polearm, claymore, or sword external to that character's kit. For Electro, Anemo, and Geo, we only have self-infusions, like Keqing and C6 Dori for Electro, C6 Lynette and Kazuha for Anemo, which I don't have either of, and Chiori for Geo. There are also other self-infusers I haven't mentioned, which are Ayaka and Diluc. This rounds out all the characters that have an infusion ability. I do expect that future versions will have characters that can act as external infusers, but that might take a while since the most recent one was Candace, and, well, she was released more than a year ago now, so really not that recent. I mentioned earlier that infusions can be overridden. This begs the question, what happens when you mix multiple infusions together? Do they react with one another? And which infusion takes priority? Before getting into that, we first need to discuss how infusion application timing works. First, let's start with the external infusers. Bennett applies his Pyro infusion every second you stand in his circle, with each application lasting 2.1 seconds. Candace applies her infusion every half second, with each application lasting 1 second. And finally, for Chongyun, his infusion applies once every second, with application duration depending on what talent level his skill is, with 3 seconds being the max. As for self-infusers, aside from the one exception in Diluc, they all only apply their infusion once for the whole duration. Diluc reapplies Pyro onto his weapon every half second, and the duration per application varies between these characters, as you can see on screen. However, due to the fact that the application frequency is only 1 per use, these aren't that relevant to how these self-infusions interact with external infusions. Finally, every infusion application instance applies a single gauge unit. A gauge unit is the base unit of application when talking about how much of an element you apply to an enemy, or in this instance, a weapon. I won't be going into too much depth here regarding this, since gauge unit theory is a video of its own. If you would like to learn more about gauge unit theory, I recommend you to watch this video on the subject by Joe's Spiral Abyss Guides. It's extremely well made and brief given the complexity of the topic. This video's existence is also probably why I won't make a gauge theory video, unless we're talking with respect to Lagrangians. With this information on hand, we're ready to show what the interactions between these infusions look like. So first off, let's start with the external infusers' interaction with one another. If you combine Bennett and Candace together, you'll see a steam-like effect emit from the infused weapon, indicating a vaporize reaction is occurring. This happens multiple times while the infusion windows are up due to the reapplication timing. However, what you'll notice is that a majority of the normal attacks are dealing hydro damage here. The main reason is that Hydro has a reaction cost advantage over Pyro. When Hydro is applied onto a Pyro aura, 1 gauge unit of Hydro consumes 2 gauge units of Pyro. This is also known as forward vaporize. In the opposite direction, otherwise known as reverse vaporize, 1 gauge unit of Pyro consumes half a gauge unit of Hydro. Because of this reaction cost advantage, the Hydro infusion provided will take over the Pyro infusion most of the time. And, well, as a fun fact, when dealing reactions to enemies, forward vaporize will have a 2 times damage multiplier in the damage calculation, whereas reverse vaporize has a 1.5 times multiplier. In a similar manner with Bennett and Chongyun, the Pyro infusion will take over the Cryo infusion, resulting in a majority of your normal attacks dealing Pyro, while you have the melt reaction proccing on the weapon. When Pyro is applied onto a Cryo Aura, 1 gauge unit of Pyro consumes 2 gauge units of Cryo, also known as Forward Melt, and for Reverse Melt, 1 gauge unit of Cryo consumes half a gauge unit of Pyro. Similarly to how Vaporize works, forward version of Melt also has a 2 times damage multiplier, with the reverse version having a 1.5 times damage multiplier. Because standard elemental rules are still applied during the time when both infusions are active, it's actually possible to deal physical damage while in between application windows. It's actually really cool that the devs applied the normal reaction rules. It makes the game a lot more immersive in a way. Pyro plus Hydro made Vaporize, and Cryo plus Pyro made Melt occur on the weapon, so the natural assumption would be that Cryo plus Hydro would freeze the weapon, and you'd be correct! During the state, the normal attack damage dealt is Cryo damage, which makes sense, because if you apply Pyro to a frozen enemy, the reaction that occurs is Melt, meaning that the aura is Cryo-based rather than Hydro-based. Probably the coolest aspect of this effect is seeing frozen weapons, like this frozen fish ready to sell to the market, or Maluika's weapon. Now that I've finished talking about the external infusers, it's time to talk about the self-infuser interactions. Starting off with Electro, both Dory and Kaching have their infusions overridden by both Pyro and Cryo, triggering Overload and Superconduct respectively. Since both of them have a one-time application, the Electro infusion won't be recovered until the ability creating the Electro infusion is cast again. However, Hydro is a bit weird. Instead of removing the Electro infusion outright, both will coexist. The normal attack damage in this state will be Hydro until the Hydro infusion is removed, and then you'll deal Electro damage if the Electro infusion hasn't run out. Pretty cool stuff if you ask me. As for Anemo, I don't have either of the necessary constellations on Lynette or Kazuha to get Anemo infusion, so I called in a friend. In case you don't know who this is, Soluna is a fellow Genshin content creator who also does dumb shenanigans. If you enjoy my videos, give his channel a look, you might find something you like there. Going back to Anemo infusion interactions, you can see that Swirl is triggered when an additional infusion is added to an existing Anemo one. The AoE for this is fairly small, but it's pretty interesting to see. Another thing to note is that the reaction damage dealt depends on which infusion was applied last. You can see that here when I trigger Overload with Kaching's infusion versus Bennett's infusion. If Kaching gets her infusion first, and then walks into Bennett's ult, the Overload damage scales based on Bennett's EM, since his was the last infusion applied. However, if Kaching gets Pyro infused first, and then casts her skill to get her Electro infusion, the damage scales off Kaching's EM. Again, a really cool attention to detail, since this is exactly what happens when you do these reactions directly on enemies. The stats from the character who triggers the reaction matter, not the character who provided the initial elemental application. Given this, Soluna and I did try to do some VV shenanigans. In theory, by equipping VV onto Chongyun and have him be the applier to trigger Swirl on Lynette's weapon, we should be able to reduce the resistance of Masanori, 4-piece VV on Chongyun. However, this didn't work, largely due to weird co-op interactions with infusions. One of us would see the Swirl, but the other wouldn't, and so as a result, the Swirl just does no damage. Would it have been practical in an actual combat situation? Unlikely. But it would have been funny. Given that both Electro and Anemo react with other elements in the same way you'd expect, you would think that Geo would produce crystallized shards upon contact with other infusions. Unfortunately, this is where the consistency ends. For some reason, Geo infusion doesn't interact with other infusions whatsoever, resulting in no reaction occurring on the weapon. When an external infusion is implied while a Geo infusion is active, the external infusion takes priority damage-wise. If the external infusion ends before the Geo infusion does, the Geo infusion comes back, similar to how Electro and Hydro interacted earlier. It would have been cool had crystallized shards actually spawned, as some interesting Petra combinations may have been created, but alas, it wasn't meant to be. It's likely that the devs forgot to code in this interaction with Chiori, as she is the most recent character to be released with an infusion, though, to be fair, she is the first and only Geo infuser in the game as of recording this video in 5.3. Now, of course, you can apply more than 2 infusions at once, but they follow the interactions I've already mentioned, so there isn't much of a point to discuss them in further detail. Over-vaping a weapon is kind of funny though. I hope you've learned something about infusions through this video. Although many of the interactions shown in this video aren't necessarily that applicable in a well-formed team, future infusers may change that. An example would be a Dendro infuser. If the devs code the interaction in, it's possible that we would get the ability to spawn Bloom Cores from a weapon, or be able to have Dendro and Anemo/Geo coexist on a weapon. Or, depending on how the application timing works out, we might be able to proc Hyper Bloom from a weapon, though that would require an external Dendro Infuser. Either way, the infusion system in Genshin is extremely underutilized, and I would like to see more of it fleshed out considering the interesting possibilities that could come from it. That said, this is Taurus Blammo, signing out. I hope you enjoyed the video, and see you next time.